Okay, so I'm going to get into McCarraher's book, The Enchantments of Mammon. I'm going to start at the beginning and just work my way through it as best I can. And the first part starts with medieval Europe, starts with the beginnings and kind of traces both what existed at that time and also what developed over time. So McCarraher, right off the bat, I just want to say he does acknowledge very clearly that things were not ideal in the Middle Ages regarding the church. The Catholic Church experienced periods of corruption that were pretty severe, and huge amounts of materialism at certain times, especially at the top. And he also doesn't forego acknowledging that the rest of society also was not perfect. So what he's trying to get at is that he's looking at the society's ideals, like what the society said it was about, what it aspired to, what the people in it strove to be like. And he underscores that point by saying that when you saw violence, corruption, greed, and so on in medieval society, it was understood at least as an evil. In other words, they thought in terms of good and evil, sin. And so it was understood in that context, and so there was always this awareness of the idea that things could be much better. There was the standard that was, divine, and then there was the worldly reality. And so he says they were understood as evils, these corruptions, not prices to be paid for abundance. And that's a reference to the more liberal justification of what came to be known as capitalism, that a certain amount of greed and power grabbing and corruption has to occur, but the overall payout for everybody is more material abundance. So that wasn't the way that they understood it. He talks about the peasant revolts in 1358 and 1381, and those were out-and-out revolutions, and not just from the peasants, and this was in England, at least the 1381 references. People of the peasant class and the emerging, you might say, merchant class or middle class rose up and almost succeeded in revolting, but were put down eventually. And the background of that was, well, many things, but among them was that the society had just experienced a reduction of about 1/3 in their population from the Black Death, and this had shook up the economy. It had made the price of labor go up. It had created new vacancies and openings for people to move up to fill certain roles, and they weren't willing to be serfs anymore in some cases after this, and they started to rebel against that level of control and also against the taxation that came down hard on them. And so if you look at those events, you realize that people have been doing this type of thing for a long time. I mean, they did things like ransack and burn down, government buildings and just wreak havoc, trying to revolt against the powers that be. There was this alternative vision way back in the 14th century in which, people would be in charge, that people would be able to have more of a say in their own destiny. Now, as far as the ideals of the medieval period that later waned, there's an emphasis on medieval sacramentality. Again, I think I mentioned this when I highlighted moving into this series, that McCarraher comes to this book with an idea of sacramentality that's informed by the Catholic teachings on the Eucharist. So the sacramental mentality for McCarraher is something like, the presence of God in the material world and how that manifests itself. And in medieval culture, this was understood through, first of all, the incarnation of Christ and the fact that Christ was once in bodily form on earth, that he then left but was still alive, of course, in heaven, but that he had left the Holy Spirit and he had left the Eucharist, which was this very physical existence within the world of Christ. And so this sacramental eucharistic mentality was always before them, always a part of medieval Christian people. And so it produced a profound conviction, he says, in the material beatitude and beloved community. Okay? In other words, that the best possible spiritual existence could be seen sort of in kernel within even the corrupt material world. He mentions the medieval guilds. These collected working people of various trades and set their rules and standards of production. And they were sort of fraternal in nature. I don't know much about the guild system. In fact, I learned from reading McCarraher's book that they not only, set standards and prices and so on for their trades, but also acted in a fraternal way to provide mutual aid for each other, to do charitable works like supporting orphanages and the poor and endowing hospitals, churches, and universities. So his point in mentioning the guilds is that they were working people's associations, supposedly, with an eye to the trade, but they were more than that. They didn't conceive of themselves merely as money-making entities. He mentions the idea of the commons. There was a different notion of property in a lot of cases in medieval Europe. He says before the Norman invasions, he would be speaking of England here, before the Norman invasions of the 11th century, village land in Saxon England belonged not to individual people or families, but to all residents of the village, and individuals enjoyed rights of use, not ownership. After, common rights remained conditional on fealty and tribute to the manorial noble. So still, people had certain rights to use, but didn't have the same conception of absolute property rights to the exclusion of all others. And there were rules that changed later on that, for instance, allowed people to use lands that were held by a noble for certain purposes, maybe their own farming, maybe hunting. This began to change as time went by, with nobles being more aware or, insistent on their property rights and enclosing the land. But he's talking about prior to that. The commons, he says, pointed to a barely repressed desire for communism that lurked as the political unconscious of medieval Christendom. And there he's talking about a sort of Christian communism or communalism, that the ideal was still that people were brothers and sisters, and that ideally to be Christians meant to share completely and to not withhold what you had from others who needed that. And so there was this notion of communalism or communism that lurked in the back of people's minds as the ideal, even at the same time as there were vast differences between the wealthy and the poor. There were medieval communists. We had the lay people, the Beguines and the Bigards. Again, I'm probably massacring those names, but they were lay people, women and men, who decided to live together in more or less anarchistic Christian lay communities from the 13th to the 16th century. They would get together, sometimes in a large group, sometimes just 2 or 3, maybe 2 or 3 women would live together, and a lot of times they would make their money from a job in the city or some sort of work. So they didn't just produce everything they needed for themselves, but they brought what they made back to this community, and they lived communally in Christian sisterhood and brotherhood. We have the Brethren of the Free Spirit, who are really quite radical. They had unorthodox teachings about God and Christ and sex and all sorts of things. They rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, and they basically thought that human beings could achieve complete divinization, unity with God, that there was no need for intermediary. A little bit more mildly, we have St. Francis of Assisi, who stayed an Orthodox Catholic, but his existence, McCarraher said, would be incomprehensible outside the idealization of poverty and dispossession. There was a strong strain within Catholic theology that did idealize poverty, the renunciation of goods, living in poverty, basically remove the temptations and remove the blocks that could keep a person from becoming closer to God. So there were these people who were constantly pushing back, and he says they pushed back particularly as commerce began to grow, as the economy started to grow in the wake of the plague, and in periods of less warfare, the economy began to take off and eventually leads to the Renaissance. And with the Renaissance, you have this growing glorification, he says, of riches and acquisitiveness. And it is accompanying, this accompanies, I should say, the assuaging force of sophisticated charity. So he's saying that as we got richer and richer, and more, a larger class that became very comfortable with luxury and material goods. Alongside that grew a charitable apparatus that sort of became like a dual system. You could live exceedingly well, but you also had this place where you would siphon some of your funds and goods to charity, and this supposedly kind of kept the spiritual balance for you so that you were still in God's good graces. This may have been where the initial mistake starts really showing, right? When you think that, as they did, that you could more or less pay spiritually for your wealth with charity or charitable acts instead of renouncing wealth. Perhaps this is where they made a mistake. But again, there were always these groups that were saying, no, you need to renounce wealth. You need to share. Of the 15th and 16th centuries, he says, well-to-do Christians could worship in opulent cathedrals, adorn themselves in sumptuous clothing, and donate to the poor and to the religious orders thanks to their sophisticated banking, credit, and accounting systems. And I think that he mentions this because the giving could be more and more remote. We start to have a system of charity that's sophisticated enough that the wealthy person can give to somebody over here who does the charitable work for them. They don't really need to see it, but they can still be associated with it. And he also says Protestant capitalists reworked the sacramental imagination of medieval Catholicism, aligning its conviction of metaphysical enchantment with the imperatives of dispossession, enclosure, and profit. So this is the time of the Protestant Reformation. And there's a rejection with Protestantism of a lot of the more enchanted nature of Catholicism, okay? But McCarraher is going to show how with Protestantism rejecting some of the more overt sacramental presences, you might say, of Catholic theology, instead of being able to put enchantment aside and become truly disenchanted, he says instead they threw the enchantment into, as we'll see, to some extent superstition, but also more importantly into their economic activities. They began to make this move where their economic activities could be in effect sacramental. enclosure was going on. These are some old walls. When the nobles began to enclose their land, they did so that they could make more money off of the grazing of cattle or sheep, typically, rather than off of the farming of the peasant class. And so even though these peasants had been living on this land for generation after generation after generation, and they had these quasi-rights, no, don't get me wrong, they were also abused, but they also had these quasi-rights to live off that land and to live in the houses that they lived in for generations in continuity. And suddenly, with the growth of this new money-making venture, the nobles began to enclose their land. They also enclosed it against the peasants from hunting and fishing. So these peasants were dispossessed in a lot of cases. They couldn't even take most of their property with them. They had no roof over their head now. They had no ability to live off the land. And these are the people that start, massing in the cities trying to find work, and they fuel the beginning of the industrial machine, okay? But nobody is looking out for them. McCarraher says of this period of time, the age of capitalist enchantment began in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, sweeping away the sacramental moral economy of the medieval commons. A capitalist vanguard of landowners and merchants constructed a regime of improvement. So as time went by, the changes that they made for the sake of making money were also characterized as improvements. And as we'll see, God was thought of as always approving of improvements, and also of seeing people who were idle, which would be, the peasant class that's been thrown off the land and might not be able to find work in the city, to see them as sinful because idle, because not working. They literally would throw these people off the land and then turn around and blame them as sinners and vagabonds and throw them in jail because they couldn't find a job and couldn't feed themselves. But there were other Protestants, just like during the Catholic, many centuries of Catholic primacy, there were more or less Catholic Christian communists out there, who pushed back against materialism and greed. There rose up Protestants who wanted to do the same thing, who weren't content to sit by and watch Protestantism sort of evolve into the worship of Mammon. And so up came these, these interesting groups, for instance, the Diggers, led by Gerard Winstanley, who was really like the original occupier, because they did just that. They'd literally say, hey, look, we kind of unorthodox Christians in our community are going to come on your land that you've enclosed, and we're going to start working it, and we're going to start, hunting and so on, and try to take care of ourselves. Come get us if you want to. So there's a quote from him. He said, "Was the earth made to preserve a few covetous, proud men to live at ease, and for them to bag and barn up the treasures of the earth from others, that these may beg or starve in a fruitful land? Or was it made to preserve all her children?" So yeah, the Diggers, literally because they dug in your land, if you were a noble, you might have to go out there and survey that land every once in a while because somebody might be digging it up to try to feed themselves. Anyway, the point is, and McCarraher does this throughout, there's always these groups in every century, in every time in the Christian history that are saying no, there's an alternative way. Christian history is rather studded by these groups, as it turns out, and this is one of the great revelations of reading McCarraher's book. John of Laden. Okay. I have a recommendation. You have to pay $1.99 for this, but go to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. You might have to go to his website and purchase his Prophets of Doom treatment of John of Laden. This man was a Protestant unorthodox, communal radical, okay, who was very anti materialism, very anti church authority, except for his own. He kind of like made himself out to be the authority. Well, the way Dan Carlin tells it, this man was just a radical maniac who was rather bloodthirsty and ended up being so puritanical with his own, he took over a community and then, ran it into the ground. Well, eventually he got surrounded and defeated, but anyway, check that out. I mean, there were people who were just extremely convicted about their principles regarding Christianity, and some of them became very, very extreme and violent. There were all kinds of groups. He says they invoked the medieval ideal of communism, establishing experiments in community of goods, while Calvin and his brethren in Geneva enforced a tightly regulated commercial economy, even as they ended traditional restrictions on usury. I guess the mistake of a lot of these more radical Protestant groups was the same mistake religious people of all kinds tend to make. They get so insistent upon the one way that they start abusing their own people and everybody else around them. But nevertheless, the impression I want to leave you with on this one is, at all times there has been this push and pull of Christians who want to reconcile Christianity with large scale mammon. And there are those who are saying, no, this is wrong, this is sinful, and they have a tendency to want to live communally.